the exhibition and also host this event today.
Sure.
I want to start by talking about the genesis of the body of work a little bit. I know this is drawn from a book which is a copy of right here.
Yeah.
50 Centuries of Art, which is a book that was in your childhood home and was incredibly influential to you.
Right. Yeah. Um, so I was youngest of six kids, crazy Puerto Rican, German, Norwegian family, four older sisters. It was like super crazy, and that book was on our coffee table, and I just remember like looking at it all the time, and I loved the images in there. It was like, naked people and beautiful creatures and wars and just all kinds of things that like nobody would talk to me about. Nobody, you know what I mean? Nobody at church, nobody at school. So it was like this place where I was like, why is this okay here? Like, or that art was like this place to sort of talk about things I couldn't talk about anyplace else. And so fast forward now, last spring, I had a long-term relationship end, and if you know me, my big issue in life has been like, you know, love and intimate relationships or whatever. And so I was like, I just like I need to know, I need to like, I was like, I just want to figure out what this is. Like, what's going on with me in this love thing? So I um I just was like, I thought about, these old, for some reason, these old paintings that I love so much came back to my mind. I remembered this book, and it was sort of like it all came full circle. And so I started very, those large abstractions were just sort of like pulling from, like kind of starting with one of these paintings and just kind of seeing where it would go. And then it just like took off. And then I moved in here in June, and it really took off. So the whole summer was just kind of cranking these things out.
I'm really interested in two things related to that book. One, it's a fairly slim volume for 50 Centuries of
Yeah,
Art.
exactly.
It's a
Yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
condensed history, I noticed.
Mm-hmm.
And because it is 50 Centuries of Art, I'm interested in why you latched onto the Baroque period as a young child, or if it's something that you didn't necessarily latch onto at the time, but on revisiting that volume, something that came back to you more thematically, as you were saying.
I think, yeah, I think that it wasn't, it was like everything in this book that I liked. And so, but coming back, I think the Baroque period, I think this, like the two bodies of work before this, or the three bodies of work before this, were all sort of um, like one was called The Last Romance, and it was just the idea of like making big abstract paintings seemed really romantic to me. So I just kind of went with it, leaned into the cliche, leaned into the sort of like, you know, and the, you know, and so I think thinking about like romantic period and, they're just so over the top. And I just think that they are beautiful paintings. And also it was like even then investigating like what is it about this that I find so beautiful. And that's a very learned notion of beauty and things like that.
Is this the first time you've done a full body of work that comes from the act of copying or the act of kind of looking at art history from an analytical or reproductive standpoint?
Not since I was 5, and because I would like draw little copies of these paintings in the margins. So yeah, this is definitely the first time that I'm like, they're very direct. I'm looking at one painting and I'm just trying to paint it. And I liked the sort of not, no concept, no big ideas, just try to paint this thing. And then all the problems that ensued there, and just the sort of like different stopping places and all the material choices, and was like more than enough to sort of like, I feel like I just kind of like figured out the territory, and now I really want to dig in and keep going.
Did you find that it was an adaptive practice of working within your own methodology and applying it to these reproductions, or were you getting into kind of materiality of the originals and reworking that?
Definitely the first. It's funny because like I teach at the School Art Institute, and so when I teach painting, I'm always like, I followed all my own rules. I'm like, what would happen if I just followed all my own rules? Of like, okay, work general to specific, work big shapes to small shapes. Like bigger shape, use a bigger tool. Smaller shape, use a smaller tool. So they're all in a way very like straightforward.
I'm interested in the development of the series over time, which has been a pretty condensed period of time. I think since April that you began,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and as recently as the last couple of weeks, finishing up some additional works that have been in the show.
Yeah.
And we see this both reduction in scale and also this articulation of the figure.
Mm-hmm.
The original works are very large, are very abstract, are suggestive of the source material, but not necessarily reproductions of the source material.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see this kind of emerging of maybe a more faithful reproduction in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then most recently, this reduction in scale, which has a real richness and a compact value.
Yeah.
And can you just talk us through kind of what that development of the series has been like, and if you feel like these small works are the end point, or if this is, as you said, something you kind of just resolve and will move forward with?
Well, I just didn't. I guess I thought, well, it's not really enough to just copy a painting, you know. So I was like, I can use these as a beginning point, a departure point. I really was using them initially just for like just some like essential color, essential shapes, just kind of trying to get at like sort of the like what is it about this that I love, and don't worry about all the details and stuff. And but then the more I made them, they really just like took over, you know, like it didn't at a certain point, and this is really fun as an artist if you can get into a conversation with your work where you have no idea what the fuck is going on and you're just like you're like just trying to sort of like stay on the train. That's like that's the best, you know what I mean? And so I just kind of let the work do what it did, and in some cases it got really like I noticed that sometimes they get really tight and then sometimes they get really loose, sometimes they're, you know, so each one, and even in different paintings within each particular paintings there may be places where it's really loose and some places where it's really tight, and sort of like noticing myself sort of like breathing in and out in the painting was really interesting. And then and it's funny because all the big ones came first, and then I kind of worked my way into smaller things, which is really weird. And also that I would go from abstract to more representational. That seems backwards, but I always, I'm always doing things backwards. I'm always doing things kind of wrong or whatever, or in the, you know. But I think these last ones were really. It was funny. I mean, you know, it's a lot of paint. It's, you know what I mean. So I was like, uh, I just sort of like, it just sort of everything kind of lined up for them to sort of then get really really focused, and they were so the small ones were just felt very like rarefied, you know, like all the like just I don't know, it was. And I had a, I mentioned this earlier, like I had a Ray Yoshida was my one of my advisors in grad school, and he would have lunch in my studio before I got there. So when I got there, because I was in another class, I get there and he had like thought about everything, and he would just say one thing, you know, like one really great thing. And one time I walked in, he said, "It's just better when you're quiet," you know. So this kind of small, more quiet, more like condensed thing, and it just packs a little bit more of a punch. But they're, but I like making the big ones. You know what I mean? Like they're a lot more fun.
Do you see that as a working through that it takes getting those out of your system to get to a point of working quietly in this motif?
That's totally, yeah. And I think it's this breath thing again, where like I made all these small ones now, and I think if you look back at my practice and all the different bodies of work, you'll kind of see like this constant like harmonizing of like abstraction, and then it gets really representational, and then it gets really personal, and then it gets really social, and like, you know, so it's like I'm always kind of like, well, what haven't I done, or what haven't I done in a while? What would be really fun to do after doing all of this? So it's sort of like yeah, it's definitely one thing leading to another, and it's sort of like having its own mind in a way too. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that another departure in kind of your working methodology was that you did these one at a time without starting another work.
Yeah.
Is that something that you challenged yourself to do, or is it
Yes.
something
Yeah.
related to this kind of action of copy or reproduction, or where did that focus come from?
I think it was just like typically I would start 4 to 10 paintings at a time so that I wouldn't overly focus on one thing. But I think I don't know what it was. It was just like it was all these things that I was like, you know, maybe I need to live my life differently or something. And it sounded and sort of like uh, um, it sort of found its way here of like I think because it was just one, I was only looking at one painting at a time. I just was like, what would happen if I just did one painting at a time, you know, beginning and end, and it was really like healthy. It felt healthy, you know.
It was a real surprise as well, just because you've been so prolific with this series. It's been such a brief period of time that it's developed so fully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah,
Is
yeah,
that typical of many? Because I know most of the work of yours that I'm familiar with are these kind of, if they're not dedicated series, you can look at them as distinctive bodies of
yep,
work. Is
yep,
that typical of you?
yeah.
Is it something that usually develops quickly and resolves quickly?
Usually it's not this quick. I think usually it's like, well, no, actually that's not true. I mean, it's they overlap, so that's one thing. This didn't overlap with anything, and but yeah, I think it's like it's almost seasonal. Feels like there's like three bodies of work a year, and it's responding to what's happening in the culture, what's happening in my life, what's happening. You know, it's like it's all very kind of responsive, being responsive to things, and um, trying to like. I mean, it's not like it's not very conscious. It's not like I'm going to do this now. It's more like, oh, like it's like this is what's happening. This is what I need to do in response to that. Yeah.
Looking back over some of your other bodies of work, this one came as kind of a surprise when I first started seeing this work show up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I want to kind of talk about those common threads, and you referenced earlier that there are always kind of these maybe these acts of personal resolution or searching.
Yeah.
But your content has changed radically over time, and always has, like I said, this kind of distinct sense of a body of work. In one of your shows, which I saw, I think about a year ago, at the Suburban in
Yeah.
Milwaukee, were these kind of pastoral scenes or these like heavily Midwestern
Mm.
themes,
Very, yeah.
and like a lot of kind of teenage life and teenage angst. And there's like a kind of melodrama, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not my
Mm-hmm.
favorite word for it,
Yep.
but
Yep.
that infuses all of your work. And sometimes I don't know how seriously to take it.
Yeah.
If it is a bit of like a wink and a nudge, or if it is something that actually the longer you look becomes this like cracking open of this very vulnerable state of being.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in kind of where those jumps between the bodies of works have occurred, or if it's all quasi biographical, as a lot of artists.
Yeah. I think it's all biographical. I think it is definitely both. I'm I take myself way too seriously, or what, you know, like I I like I said, it's like this. It's a romantic notion. Just even to make paintings is like it's like, you know, all these things going on in the world, and this is what I'm doing, you know, and or like I have to make this painting, or like, you know, it all just sounds so crazy in a way, or silly, but I mean it, you know. So it's like it is definitely both. It's almost like, you know, I totally mean this. Like it is, yes, it's over the top. It's a romantic notion, or it's melodramatic, and you know, I'm a hopeful romantic, and all those things. But also, it's like I see that I kind of I feel like I see the sort of absurdity of a lot of that too. Um, and I think also, um, I just remember this poet David White talked about. He was talking about like becoming an artist, and he was saying like you have to. He said you have to enunciate the exact nature of your exile.
Mm-hmm.
And what he meant by that is like find the biggest problem in your life, because that's where your work is, you know. And so that has stuck with me because it's like this practice is any of our practices is like it's like a way to sort of respond to these problems and actually make them into a gift, or make them meaningful, or, you know, resolve them in some way. This whole body of work kind of led me back to that person that I had that relationship with. So it's really interesting, like, you know, we needed this time apart, but you know, it's just kind of like that was a big surprise, you know. So it's very, on one hand, melodramatic and silly, and on another hand, it's like very urgent, you know.
You mentioned earlier too, following your own rules or kind of inventing a set of parameters for this body of work. And I'm curious because like the copying of the old masters is again something that's almost cliche.
Exactly.
And as someone who's been a professor and
Yeah.
teaches painting,
Mm-hmm.
if this was for you an exercise that brought your teaching practice into a different focus.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it was like I remember doing this body of work, and a bunch of students came and like, what do you guys think, you know? And they were like, it's really good to see you put your money where your mouth is, like you're doing you're practicing what you preach. And it's like, okay, that's good. So I mean, in a way, it's a little bit like that, but I think like I'm also really embarrassed by these in a way. Like and meaning like um, I'm not like they're because they're so romantic and because it's so cliche. It's like it's a little bit of a feels like a weird thing to do. You know what I mean? Yeah.
When you see them in person, I will say no art translates all that well to photographs.
Yeah.
Um, but there is such a depth and a richness to them. And I think you were saying earlier that you have only used oil paint and no other medium.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that approach allow you to work quicker, or kind of this. There is so much of your hand in these works, and even though they are works that are either maybe a little obscure or some that are renowned works you recognize in an instant, they
Right.
do very much, if you're familiar with your work, read as your work.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good.
But we can just talk a little bit more about kind of the developmental process of actually making the paintings.
Yeah, about actually making them. Yeah, I don't use any. In this work, I didn't use any mediums because I well, one thing was I didn't want to get bogged down. And I wanted them to feel like drawings in a way. And so like best way to do that was to work quickly and work in a really physical way. I wanted to have fun. I wanted to sort of like celebrate these paintings. I wanted to enjoy myself. So I just yeah, I didn't want it to get bogged down in little things. And so I just like and you can't do that if you use a lot of mediums, things get too loose and muddy or whatever. So I kept the paint really dry so I could like lay it on and then lay it on and then lay it on and so and then it just it gets really unruly. It gets really like impossible to work with, and so you just sort of like that weird. There's a weirdness I think to like or an awkwardness to like just not quite getting something that at first I would have resisted that, and then now I really I look for that moment where like that feels really weird, So, um, but I think like I had to. You can see it in the smaller ones where I start to figure out how that works best, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, especially with for the people sitting in room the three that are by the door frame back there. There's a different kind of legibility to those works.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Than there is even to the other smaller scale ones, especially looking at kind of the earlier first maybe dozen works in the series.
Yeah.
Where there's that tightness and that complication almost of the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny to look at them from across the room because they are almost less legible
Yes.
as a whole image until you're right in front of them and can really see that surface.
Yeah. Yeah. That's because I'm painting them here, which is not a good idea, right? I should always be moving back and forth, but they're small, and I feel like when they're small, you need to look at them up close, and so if it's big, you can experience them back here, or so. Like I hope that they kind of like I think of little paintings as like jewels. You got to get in really close and they should be sort of a lot going on, but you got to get up close to really get it.
Do you feel like that's the resolution of the series or the end point, or is it something where you feel like this will carry on further?
No, I think well, like I said, I'll say this and then it won't happen, or it'll happen totally differently. But I thought like I feel like this was just me understanding this territory because there's so much more I want to do, and so I can't wait to like get this work out of here and like start all over again. I need like I'm just in this like moment of like rest and chilling out for a second, but there's so much I want to do. Like there's so many directions I want to take this, and I keep finding more. And I went to the store, got a big stack of old art books, and I was like, yes, and they're just like there's this that's all from the Hermitage Museum in Moscow. I don't know any of those paintings, right? Those are like totally foreign to my mind, and so that's really exciting. I just want to like, I could do. And then I also thought about like doing like picking a painting and then making that 40 times and see what happens there, or like there's just so many options. But what I like about this is I don't have to. I like the non-concept of it, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean? Or it just seems really straightforward in a way.
That's why I think I'm so interested in the parameters that you've set on it.
Yeah.
Because they're not arbitrary.
Right.
And it's so much about the working order. Like I said, by entering kind of this very basic practice of copying the old masters or copying a different era of work,
Yeah.
that has its own rigid rules that
Right.
you aren't following, which you've created
Right.
a subset of rules that are layered on top.
Yeah.
It's something that is so, or what struck me about it beyond just the works themselves was how intrinsically complicated it is in just the action of studying art history.
Yeah.
And to see somebody who has been working for so many years and is so established and who is very much involved in the academic discourse, take that and kind of break it open and see what you can do with it if you approach it not just as a place to start, but a place to start again.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me to think that like this is something that you are just working out, and that it has taken kind of an initial, that the same way that when you are learning how to do this, you take kind of the introduction class and you learn these things and you learn the vernacular of them and you learn the process of them. And to see where you take that, I'll be very interested.
Yeah. It's always like always going back, always going back to the beginning, always sort of like rethinking. I mean, I think that's coming from, when I was in grad school, nobody was painting in the painting department. Everybody was like doing performance and making sculpture and installation. And it was like, there was this unspoken thing about you shouldn't make a painting unless you have a good reason to make a painting. And so everybody was like, what is painting? It was like very conceptual. Galen Gerber, Michelle Grabner, it was like really intense, and so I think whenever I kind of get into a new body of work, I go back to the very beginning, and try to find like what is it in its most essential form. And this feels like some place of beginning, like these painting, not my paintings, but this romantic era, this like European thing, which is all like there's a lot of problems in these paintings, right? There's just all, and I'm really aware of that. So that's weird too. But yeah, something about going back to that beginning again and again and again. And I feel like I make paintings to figure out why I'm making the painting, so it's like I don't figure it out and then make the painting. It's definitely like I figure out why I'm doing this. It starts out just very, I like kind of emotional, but then later on I start to understand what it means. I make them and I'm like, oh, this is about this or this is about that, kind of thing.
I'm curious as well because this is you just moved into the space that we're in now. The entire show is installed. Thank you again for generously allowing for that presentation of it. But you moved in I think June, you said?
June, yeah.
So it's really been the bulk of this body of work has been made here, and I'm curious about that transition into like the live work space and what it's been like to be so focused and doing one work at a time and have that in the space with you and have the entirety of the series on the walls around you down to works hanging in your kitchen.
It's really weird.
I mean, is that something you've done in the past?
Yeah, I have. Other than grad school, I've always had my studio in my home, and I think it's just because I'm busy. I like to teach a lot, work a lot, and so if I had to go someplace, I would never paint. And I just love, like all summer I was teaching all summer long, early college program high school students, and I would get up at like 4 and like do some writing or whatever, and then I would have like an hour to paint. And so by the time I finished that hour of painting, like the rest of the day was gravy. And so it's just like I love to be able to have that integrate. I think my whole life, whenever I show students my work, I'm always like, it's all this conversation between the problem of having like a studio practice and a life outside, kids and all that stuff. So it's like this is the first time where things feel really hyper integrated. This apartment did that for me too, like having that space and natural light and this time. So it was just like a nice gift. So that's why it just like, came
right
out.
Circumstance, right time, right space.
Totally, yeah.
I think it's a good time to do questions from everybody here.
What do you think, Ernie?
Love it.
Thank you.
I'm one of those people who like the big paintings.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm in it. So and I love the brush strokes. It's just so big and it's very dramatic to me. That's what I love about it.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it.
Thanks. It's awesome. Yeah. Chris.
Have you thought about, I know you said it's sort of like just a light emotional approach to sort of, have you ever thought about the intentionality of behind each one of these works to document either a rich person or a time in history?
Right.
Have you thought about that? 'Cause it sounds like you have the way you described your.
No, I mean that I'm aware of it. Like I said, I'm aware of like the problems of the painting in a way of like, you know, the histories of these paintings. Um, and I think when they get cartoony and weird, there's this moment of critique there too. Like, am I making fun of it in a way? Like, I feel like some of them I'm kind of making fun of these characters too, myself included. Um, there's this whiteness to them too, and I'm actually Puerto Rican, so but I was all but like I remember at a certain point, and this wasn't intentional, but like I started just like that didn't come up anymore, and it was like this weird passing as white thing, and um, so it's just like really complicated, you know what I mean? And so I have thought about it, but it's like I think in my something that you could say about a lot of my work is that I'm doing something wrong, but trying to understand it, I guess. And yeah, it's tricky. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I had another question.
Yeah.
So there's sort of that process of visual listening that you're talking about afterwards, where you sort of like decide how successful something was.
Yeah.
It looks as though in some of them that you make an intentional decision to do something while you're doing it. Is that true? To like, for instance, the eyes in the woman around the corner. That sounds like that felt very intentional, not something that just happens. Because my guess is that she didn't have those eyes in the picture.
No,
You
right.
made them that way.
Yeah.
So, like, do you ever think about those moments where you have to turn something on or off while you're about a decision-making process when you're in the middle of that?
I think it's like I wish I you know, I think it's more like I would just say like I'm just trying to paint this thing, you know what I mean? And then like something happens like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't notice that. And then I'm gonna
allow it to happen.
yeah, I'm gonna leave that as it is. And then sometimes I get really fussy and I don't like that, you know. So like when I was young and I was like, you know, after all this, then I started like really I got good at like copying things, and to the point where like by the time I was 12, I had all these sketchbooks that had like 2 or 3 lines in them, and I would turn the page because it wasn't perfect. And I got so perfectionistic, I just stopped making artwork. And then, you know, that was a bummer for so long. So then it came back when I was in college, and I was a psychology major, and I just like had, you know, it was just like kind of a not choice. Had to go back to this, and I forgot what your question was, but
sort of that moment where you have to decide
oh yeah,
what it's going to be.
yeah, fussiness,
or do you not,
right?
Do you just, you know, like, is there a moment there? Because I think there really is a moment there where you do something and you say, I'm going to do it this way versus that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely something I'm sort of, or I find, while I'm painting, I find the thing to be after, you know.
You find the thing to be what?
To be after it, like what I'm trying to get at while I'm painting it. It's not beforehand. It's sort of like, it's very gut feeling, like very gut feeling. I want to paint that painting now, you know, and so I start, and then I create all these problems for myself. Like a lot of times, I'll use all the paint. I'm not a good painter, so I'm like, I mix way too much paint for a particular painting. So when it's done, I've got all this paint left over, and I don't want to waste it. So I like pick it up and I just put it on like the next canvas, and that sort of starts the next one. I mean, that happened. You'll see, the ones that are really thick, that's what happened, and then the ones that are thinner are the ones where, you know, kind of started fresh or whatever. But that's all happening in that moment, you know. Yeah.
Did you do a lot of drawing before? I mean, like, were you looking right at the image while you were?
I didn't do any drawing, which is really unusual for me. To usually drawing is the way I get into a body of work, and so I just either printed things out or got old books and tore them out, and I just like stuck it to the wall, and I'm like looking at it, and I'm just painting it. So yeah, I didn't. It's funny now. I feel like doing some drawings. Like I'm doing everything in reverse the wrong way or whatever. But yeah.
Someone had asked me earlier. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but about Baroque as content and how that was seen actually as a regressive movement in its own time, and whether or not that was part of the dialogue you were creating by reviving this body of work.
No, I wasn't thinking about that. I think it's like you could. Um, I don't think so. I think it was more um, like aware of that, but it was already like I was doing something so dumb anyway. It was like that just didn't even matter or whatever. But or I mean, cliche again or something like that. But I think um, yeah, that's I think that's the stuff I'm thinking of later, afterwards. Like I paint and then I like think about what is what did I just, and not even about how I painted, but just like what does that even mean, you know, and how does that relate to anything happening now? I feel like in some ways this is really out of touch, but in some ways, like a lot of people have said, this feels so perfect for right now, you know. I'm like, what? Wow, you know. I'm like, well, I don't know. It just feels really like we went through this, and I think like COVID and everything was just such a hard. It was so brutal. It was so like, you know, such a hard time, and I think like the summer and like this summer, and we can be in here and like together and like being in a place where I look out the window, and it could be any century looking out that window, or that window at least, and like I don't know, it just felt so magical. So
Yeah, I will
I
say
think I think we want that.
it never occurred to me not to think of these as contemporary art.
Yeah.
I didn't ever look at them as kind of faithful enough reproductions
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
be a historical study in a very formal way.
No, yeah.
And there is something that I think part of what drew me to them, because within my own taste, Baroque art is not something that I feel particularly close to or have
Right.
ever had a really trenchant interest in.
Yeah.
But there is something really gratifying about them that I think for me did come out of like such a long period of time of not physically looking at art.
Yeah,
Of
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
like the
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of work
yeah.
that you saw in online art fairs and digital shows, and I'm as guilty as anybody else. There was a moment where the market and even institutions trying to build their online collections went for work that pretty faithfully translated in 2 dimensions.
Totally.
And this was not it.
Yep.
And there is something both texturally and in terms of content and subject where they are just really lush and really rich and really gratifying to stand in front of.
Yeah.
After a protracted period of time where
Yeah.
you just could not
Yeah.
physically be in front of work.
Yeah.
Which I think for anybody who's an art professional, like that's so much a part of your life, and that's so much the driving force, and it becomes almost an afterthought after so many years.
Totally.
That to go without that and then come back to it, there is
Yeah.
this kind of hunger for work that is satisfying on the wall in front of you.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what makes them really feel of their time now.
Yeah. That's
And
a really
it's
good point. Thank
Probably
you.
not disconnected from a lot
Yeah.
of Baroque painting or painting of that era, where that was kind of the primary medium where you were experiencing all art is contemporary art, all art is the art of its time. So I think it has in that way this kind of dialogue that is equally impactful to the origin of these works.
Yeah.
In ways.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't thought of that, but that's so true. Like that thing about looking at, I mean, I'm an obsessive Instagram user, and so like, so I think that the physicality of making these and the physicality of them as objects is definitely something that that I just love. That just it's just sort of like that. That's like why they happened in a way. And I also think like the other thing that I realized about Baroque painting and about as I was making these is there, and it's something that I cannot find in working any other way in any body of work, light. Like Baroque is so much about light, and of course painting in my mind is so much about light. You have no color without light. You have, so it was like that was the, and I think that's why the stark contrast of them was so impactful to me, and just the light in this space and the light in the little painting I'm looking at and the light on the palette. And I was just like, it just felt so great.
It's also a really interesting through line when you start talking about source material, because even as you said, you're printing things off the internet or you're looking at old books, which aren't maybe even the best reproductions.
Yeah.
qualitatively. So kind of that transition from copy to copy to copy, if that's kind of the through line, or if that's the principle upon which this can develop. It's an interesting thought to me.
Yeah.
That starts then getting into a totally different line of thought, which is about what reproduction means and what the repetition of image means, and the way that we, I think, take that for granted, especially in the digital era, that you can we can talk about an obscure painting that's in a collection in Amsterdam, and I can call it up on my phone.
Yeah.
And that still isn't the thing that we're actually talking
Right,
about.
right.
But there is this like access to representation that is unprecedented, and which I think contemporary art can feed from in a way that before you had to go and find a book that maybe had a small black and white reproduction of the thing that you're thinking of, if you could find it at all.
Right.
And that opening of source material and the way that that might have had a role coming from this book that you had in your childhood into kind of this vastness of what you could access.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that like that one on the bottom there, I tried to, because the reproduction, I don't know if it was just an old painting and it looked really darkened and like, dirty, but I tried to be faithful to that. And I don't know. But I like the idea of like finding one and trying to paint that like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To paint that bad reproduction would be really, really interesting. And I think I kept trying to do that, but I think then, but then the painting it needed to, do what it did. I think that little one in the middle there kind of, that feels like I feel like that kind of feels like an old painting. I like that, that'd be an interesting thing. Like I would love to, that's in the direction I'd like to go, is try to get really good at like nailing that bad reproduction look, but with this thick paint would be just really interesting, I think,
We have that to look forward to.
Yeah.
There are
Totally.
any other questions?
Any desire to go see an original?
Oh God, yes, of course. I think that's, I want to go so bad. I mean, I spent a lot more, I think the museum opening back up and just going to look at old paintings again and like my favorites, and also like things that I didn't pay attention to, but since I started doing these, I started paying a lot more attention to those little weird paintings in the hallway over there, the ones I didn't really notice before, and just being like, oh, there's so much that I'd like to do, but also just Dave works in the museum. I mean, it's like it's just it's just such a gift. It's so cool, and there's so much more to do.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you, Bianca, so much. It was really great.